If you're a science fiction reader, or even if you're not, and you're just interested in Philip K. Dick generally because of his critical cachet, should you bother to read his general fiction, his mainstream fiction, his literary fiction as some would have it, or should you just focus on the works which everybody talks about? Obviously he had a very, very large oeuvre. It comes to about 50 books, so there's an awful lot to get through. There are certain key things which stand out, but nobody ever seems to talk much about the general fiction these days, and most of it is in print, certainly in the UK. It's all been published now. There's nothing which is not extant. There were, of course, lost books which never saw the light of day. Maybe they were never finished. There's scant evidence for them. So we'll begin to tempt you dickheads out there by mentioning them and what they were called. There was a book called Nicholas and the Higgs, which is lost. Another called A Time for George Stavros, which we know is from the late 50s, and one called Pilgrim on the Hill. So that's Nicholas and the Higgs, which is a very typical Dickian sounding title. Reminds me of Nick and the Glimmer, the children's book, which is related to Galactic Pot Healer. A Time for George Stavros and Pilgrim on the Hill. Now, there's only scant evidence that these were ever out there. All we pretty much have is titles. Now, I'm sure there's some Dick scholars out there who probably can put me straight on that, a bit more detail, but we know these books are not extant. But there were plenty of others. So how did Philip K. Dick come to write a lot of mainstream novels? And why were effectively none of them, apart from one, Confessions of a Crap Artist, published in his lifetime? And that wasn't published till about 16 years after it was written. So we're going to do an overview today of PKD's mainstream novels. What we're not going to discuss is his final mainstream novel, The Transmigration of Timothy Archer, which is best discussed in the context of the Valis thematic trilogy. So we're not going to talk about that. But at the very end of his life, Dick's critical cachet had risen a bit. It wasn't just because of the film. That was mostly the thing. He became canonized really after Blade Runner, and of course he died just before Blade Runner was released. Very, very sad. And it's the success of Blade Runner, I feel, which pushed Dick's name into the sort of Sunday supplements and the critical papers and what have you. So he finally had to be acknowledged because, you know, underneath it all, the critics, they actually loved the film. They loved it. They thought it was great. So there you go. That's my feeling about why Dick became canonized in a nutshell. So the mainstream novels, we're not going to talk about this one. We're going to talk about the earlier ones. Now, when I first started reading Philip K. Dick in 1976, you know, it's a different world, no internet, what have you, no video recorders, so certainly not in private homes. And it was very hard to find out information about what was actually happening unless you were involved in fandom, fanzines, what have you. And I became aware of Philip K. Dick's mainstream novels in the mid-80s when they started to be issued in the UK. So we're going to go through them more or less chronologically. And nobody is entirely certain of the chronology that they were written in because they weren't published. But so we need some background really on the context of when they were written, why they were written, and what happened. Now, Philip K. Dick was born in 1928. So in 1950, which is about the time he started writing seriously, he was 22, and he had no money. He was poor, and he had all sorts of personal problems. He had agoraphobia, and he was quite a neurotic sort of guy, really. And he had gone to college in Berkeley, which was a well-known sort of hotbed of radicalism. Even then, it was quite a sort of radical place. In the 60s, it was very radical. And he sort of had a dual career. As a reader, he was reading SF, and of course this was the end of the golden age, and he absolutely loved A. Van Vogt. So he was thoroughly sort of immersed in the sort of Campbellian thing. So he really sort of read that, and he absolutely loved it, and he was addicted to it. But at the same time, he was moving in Berkeley College intellectual circles, and he was reading, modernists, people like Joyce and Woolf and what have you. So, he had this sort of bicameral thing going on. So that affected Dick. And Dick wanted to write really about serious issues in post-war America, and he was critical of the culture, and he had things to say about it. Now, at that time, it's important to remember that within genre SF, in the magazine SF, there wasn't really a lot of direct social criticism. It was more manifest destiny. You have to remember the character of people like Campbell and Van Vogt and other writers who were working with that milieu, Heinlein. They were more towards the conservative end of things, and Dick was more interested in socialism and radical ideas and civil rights, things like that. So it was a sort of interesting time. So even though Dick probably wanted to do ambitious work in SF, he really couldn't see a way to do that. So he had to sort of tackle it by writing mainstream social novels. And it's hard to say, you know, why none of them were published at the time, but there are some ideas which we'll go into. But Philip K. Dick published his first science fiction story in 1952. And I think he had 4 stories published in 52. Then in 53 there were a lot more, there was 20 something, and 54 there were a lot again. And in 1955 his first published novel, Solar Lottery, aka World of Chance, appeared. So in the early 50s he wrote a lot of these books, so we're going to go through them one by one, roughly in the chronology we think they were composed in, and just take you through them and address the question of whether you'd want to read them, because none of them are SF, they're mainstream novels, as we say. So there's different ideas about which was the first one, and the first one in terms of composition arguably is Voices from the Street. Now, Voices from the Street was the last of Dick's mainstream novels to be published. It only appeared about 18 years ago, and that was a long time after the others. Most of the others popped up during the whole late 80s, mid to late 80s period, when, you know, Dick had died. There was enormous resurgence of interest in his work, and small presses mostly started acquiring the manuscripts and putting them out in limited editions. And then there were trade editions, particularly in the UK, in paperback from Paladin. So I say this one didn't appear until, let's have a look, I think it was something like 2004. And this was a book I'd read about 2007. And I have to say, this is the only book of Philip K. Dick's I ever struggled to finish. And I actually put it down for quite a long time. And it really does show him at the beginning of his career. So the theory is this was written about 1949, 1950. So he's very young. And it's about a young man called Stuart Hadfield who works as a TV repairman. And he's having a bit of a crisis of confidence. He's married, he's got a house, you know, he seems to have it all. But he's depressed and he gets involved in drinking and drugs and a small sort of religious cult. And when you read it, it doesn't feel like PKD at all, except in the idea that it's looking at the little man and his place in American society, which is a theme that Dick sort of went right the way through, right up until his death, really. He was always a champion of the underdog. So even though it embodies that, this is the book I felt which was least Dickian. So I would say, unless you're a hardcore and you want to go through it and really sort of read everything because you've read all the SF, or you want to put the 50s stuff particularly into context, I would say Voices from the Street is for the hardcore fans. So leave that until last, because it's more like an academic exercise. It doesn't feel like PKD at all. It's very stiff, even stiffer than his mature style, and it's not really a great book in any way. There is a disagreement about whether it was the first, because fundamentally I think some authorities, particularly Lawrence Sutin, who was Dick's first biographer, wrote the absolutely fantastic book Divine Invasions, which is superb. The best big Dick biography by a long chalk. Don't go near the other ones. Is Gather Yourselves Together. Now, one theory is that this was written before Voices from the Street, but might have been sort of polished up later on. It certainly feels more assured and more like PKD, and this is an interesting one. And this is from, let's see, WCS. Who are WCS? WCS Books, Herndon, Virginia, issued in 1994. And again, this was interesting because this doesn't feel that Dickian. Supposedly it was written in 52, but as I say, Sutin and some other authorities believe it was written a bit earlier and then polished up a bit, because by 1952, when he sold his first SF stories, Dick had been signed up by the Scott Meredith Literary Agency, which was a big SF agency for decades and decades. And people like Norman Spinrad and Barry Ann Malsberg wrote for it, you know. And so that's an interesting one. I think you can get this. I'm not certain. I haven't checked. This was a limited edition. I think they printed about 1,000 of these, and I snapped this up at the time. And it's about a couple who are working in an American factory in China, and because of the sort of cultural revolution of what's happening there, they have to get out and come back to the USA. So there's lots in there about communism, and it is a long time since I've read it, but it is one of the more enjoyable ones. So if you want to read a really early PKD, that's very much the one to go for. The early ones, I will admit, I'm vaguer on because I didn't enjoy them as much and I haven't read them as much. The real meat really sort of comes in the mid to late 50s novels, which are much, much more interesting. But as we're doing this chronologically, we'll see what we can come through with. And after those sort of very early ones, you do start to get fairly sort of typical Dickian themes that start to come through in these books. You know, his critique of the post-war USA is an increasing thing throughout, and it reflects his own experiences. The early 50s novels, or at least the ones which are believed to be from the early 50s, are less typical of what Dick moves into later as his attempts to write successful mainstream novels come together and they become more assured. So two books which are after the initial pair I've shown you, or at least that's the thinking, which are sort of still less typical of him, but they feel more like Philip K. Dick, are the next ones we're going to tackle. And as there's uncertainty about the chronology, I'm going to go with the one which I feel is probably one of the earliest ones, and that's Mary and the Giant. This is the Arbor House first edition, and this was published, let's see, good grief, it's got a price sticker on it. I think I got this from Forbidden Planet in London a long time ago, and this is 1987. There's more likely to have been Forever People in Bristol, and I've only read this once. And what's interesting about this is that it has a female character as the protagonist, as the lead character, which is really unusual in PKD, and a young woman, and she's sort of making her way through life, and she ends up working for various sort of manipulative men, and the Giant is one of the men, and he's not actually a giant, though of course there is that hint of the speculative in that title. And she works in a record store, and Dick himself did that, and she's sort of looking for sort of love and looking for sort of a way through life. And it's a fairly minor book. I do need to reread it, but it is interesting in that thing where it does really look at a female character as a focus character in PKD, which is really unusual. Dick himself said that he based most of his female characters, particularly early in the writing, and this goes right the way through the 60s as well, on two of the characters in Thackeray's Vanity Fair, which is a book I haven't read since I was a kid. And, you know, Vanity Fair it really centers around a character called Becky Sharp, who's sort of manipulative, she's intelligent, she's attractive, and she's an absolute danger to men. She really is. And there's another character in the book called Amelia, who's more passive, weak, and is more sort of willing to do what men want. But both of them tend to ultimately undermine weak men, and that's something which Dick did a lot. So the female characterization in his books does tend to fall into those two types and doesn't always sort of create fully rounded characters, and that comes later in his career with people like Angel Archer in one of the later books. So really this is an interesting example of that, Dick trying with a focus character who's female. The way that women are treated in 50s America comes up quite a lot in Dick's 50s novels, because of course you're still talking about what was obviously a very sexist time, and you know it's completely different today. That comes across very strongly in this book, The Broken Bubble. The original full title, which I wish it had, was The Broken Bubble of Thisbe Holt. And Thisbe Holt, you notice that Dickian thing for odd names and odd titles, it's even there in the mainstream novels. Thisbe Holt is a young woman who, you know, and I'll be quite honest, I've not read this for years, but the parts featuring her tend to stand out. And she is somebody who's kind of taken advantage of and yet wants to be taken advantage of. And there's a climatic sort of scene where she is put inside a broken bubble. She's put inside like a clear plastic inflatable beach ball, and she's in a fetal position and she's naked, and this has been arranged by some sort of club of optometrists, and it reminds you, because it's optometrists, it makes me think of Kurt Vonnegut, and she's rolled around in this ball, and there's, you know, obviously there's a lot more to the novel than that, but that really sticks in your head because you think, gosh, you know, this is horrible, it's really exploitive. And something that Dick does in these books, he's not afraid to address the carnality of men and their rapaciousness and this sort of willingness to look at women as sex objects, and he sort of does this quite dispassionately, but you know there's no real doubt in your mind when you're reading it that he regards it as, you know, very, very unpleasant. And yeah, so that's The Broken Bubble. So those are two early minor ones which I do need to look at, but my recollections was that they were quite weak compared to the later 50s ones. And the later 50s books were the ones which emerged first, which were actually published first, because all of these were rejected by publishers when Dick was writing them and trying to sell them. And of course, because he was having increasing success with his SF, short stories for 3 years, then he started to publish novels, then, you know, he could start to make a living. And he had a very up and down social life. Of course, he was married 5 times, as everybody knows. So, you know, it was difficult, but he really sort of kept on with this. So he pumped out several of these novels before he wrote Solar Lottery. So that's an important thing to remember. And you've got to look at SF at the time. And really, one of the things that sort of characterized this, why did he keep doing this when he wasn't going anywhere, he wasn't selling them? Well, really, if he wanted to say serious things about post-war America, it was difficult to do that in SF at the time, because really the golden age had come to an end, and things like Galaxy and the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, which had more social concerns, had only just started to happen. So people like Cornbluth and Poll, the social satirists of Vonnegut, they were only at the beginnings of their careers, Sheckley, and there wasn't room yet in the market for Dick to move in and do this sort of thing. To put into context, if you think of 1953, when the first Hugo Awards were given out, that's when The Demolished Man came out. So, you know, it was a few years away before you could really sort of do serious social critiques, unless you were already established in the way that, say, Poll and Cornbluth were, you know, and they were sort of trailblazers that way. So it was hard for him to do that. So he kept at it. And what did he come out with? Well, when you get to the mid-50s onwards, till about 1960, when he stops writing mainstream novels because it's just not going anywhere and the SF is starting to take off more, he starts to produce the really good stuff, more assured mainstream novels, and they tend to address the same sort of concerns as the post-war economic boom in 50s America. There's lots of small businesses. You're starting to see the beginnings of large businesses like supermarkets, chain stores, that sort of thing. And there's a lot in the books about relations between employers and employees, about manual labour versus more bureaucratic administrative labour, and the divide between the two things, and the little man's role in that. And you also see a lot about ambition and it's being thwarted or realised, mostly thwarted because this is Philip K. Dick, and the relationships between men and women around that. So there's a lot of critique of capitalism, you could say, at least that's one theory in these books, because they do tend to revolve around small business owners. Now, of course, Philip K. Dick worked in a record store. At one point, one of his wives pretty much made him work as a craftsman making jewellery. She wanted to sell jewellery and what have you, and that was a little bit later on. So Dick had experience of frontline retail work, and that's something which is obviously very big for me being a bookseller, and he had a lot to say about that. But the beauty of these books is what you get is this wonderful picture of small town American life in the 1950s, where there's like a main street and people have their little businesses and they know their neighbours and have their relations. And it all sounds terribly dull in some ways compared to the zap power of his SF. But of course, those things are common themes in his science fiction as well. The characters and things like Joanna's Dream of Electric Sheep, or any number of his famous novels, you know, are often ordinary people. They're often ordinary business people, or people just trying to make a buck, make a living, and what have you. So it's a really important thing. So if you like those aspects of Dick's work, you will enjoy these novels. And I'm just going to talk about the ones which I think are the best now, because they're the ones from the mid to late 50s. And again, we don't have solid chronology. Probably, if I had to pick out a favourite, this would probably be number 2. And this is Pattering About in a Small Land. And Pattering About in a Small Land is a book I've read. I've read this 3 or 4 times. Let me just see if I can get the glare off it there. And I've just reread it and I really, really enjoyed it. And it's got its flaws, but it is excellent. And this is the Paladin UK first, which I bought at the time. A lot of these were done by Gollancz in hardcover. I don't think this one was, and which is why I've got this Chicago one there, which I bought relatively recently, and that's the Paladin original. Pattering About in a Small Land is one of my favourite Dick novels from this period, and it's really about 2 mismatched couples who are having problems with their marriages, and the one couple are aware of it, the other aren't really, and they become embroiled and there's an affair. The one couple, Roger Lindahl, who Roger's got a small TV store. He employs a couple of people, does repairs, sells TVs, and he's getting ready for the advent of colour television. So this has to be sort of late 50s really. Is sort of tootling along, and he's puttering about in a small land, and he's not really sort of getting on with his wife Virginia, who's slim, who's into dance, and he finds it sort of quite hard, and he really sort of wants something else in life. And this is an interesting thing. She has quite a domineering mother, and there are also flashback sequences which show Roger when he's younger, in the period after the war. And he's sort of like one of these guys who, he's an entrepreneur, but he sort of lacks vision in lots of ways. And he is looking for something else without realizing it. And the tension is really on the surface in the marriage, and you're wondering why they don't just get divorced. And they have a small son called Greg. Greg is 7.5, and he's asthmatic. And they decide that they're going to send Greg away to a boarding school, or at least consider it, to get him out of the toxic atmosphere in the house. So the novel opens with a wonderful sequence, which I love, where Virginia is driving along this very fast-moving freeway, because the drive to the boarding school, which is out in the mountains of North California, is something like 90 minutes to 3 hours. It's a long drive, and she's really stressed out by the fast pace of the cars and trucks and what have you, and she tends to be communicating this to Greg, and it's palpable. You can really feel it, and it's a wonderful opening sequence. And something that Kim Stanley Robinson said about Dick's books at this point is they lack humour, and that's absolutely true. They are pretty dark, actually, but that's something that I liked about them. And there's a certain amount of toing and froing as Virginia and Roger discuss whether Greg should go to the school or not. And you do see Roger exhibiting a certain amount of passive aggression, and it bubbles to the surface sometimes with his son, because he's clearly frustrated. And they become embroiled with this other couple with, let's see, there's Liz Bonner, who is one of the other mums who has 2 boys at the school. And they talk about sort of like a car sharing thing where one couple will drive the kids one day and the other couple will drive another day, and they're going to stay there a week, and they come home at weekends. And it's a big commitment. So you imagine that sort of school run thing amplified, but just once a week. And Liz Bonner is sort of voluptuous, attractive, rather scatterbrained, and she's a very irritating character to begin with. But her charm begins to grow on Roger. And Liz's wife, Chick, has all these aspirations about business. He's the sort of heir to a bakery empire, and he sees opportunities in Roger's TV business for it to expand and what have you, and tries to sort of get involved in that. And Roger wants none of it. And an affair starts between Roger and Liz, and Virginia is sort of pushed out in the cold, and she's quite sort of hard sort of person. And it really is a look at, you know, what these characters want out of life, and it's quite dispassionate, and you stand back and you can see the sort of arguments on each side, and Chick sort of wants to get involved with Roger's business, and he's kind of presumptuous really. So you do get involved in the kind of soap opera structure, but it is exactly the kind of thing which you really get in the SF novels as well, except that of course the novum interferes, and you know, people's lives in the future are more complicated. But it's a great look at small town America and characters and what have you. And you can see that Dick was really trying to sort of build up his critique of what was happening and how people's status reflected their own anxieties. So Pattering About the Small Land is a really good one, and I love it. It's one of my favourites. It really is. Then probably the best one, and I know Kim Stanley Robinson thinks this is the best one, and I say he may well be right, is the very wonderful In Milton Lumky Territory. Again, you get this Dickian thing of wacky titles, and you know, Milton Lumky is a salesman, and he is a quasi-peripheral character in this novel. And this is about a young chap called, let's see, what's his name? Bruce Stevens, Skip Stevens. And Skip is a fairly sort of troublesome young guy, and he is working as a buyer for a outlet, like a sort of big supermarket type outlet, and he sort of basically buys all sorts of stuff direct from manufacturers, and is so cheap, and people drive to this big warehouse type thing. It doesn't have a window, it's like a conventional shop, so it's like a wholesale outlet but aimed at the general public. And you know, it's cutting out the middleman, the small retailer. So you're already beginning to see this conflict between small business and large business in American life. And Bruce goes back to his hometown, and he ends up dropping in to see an old girlfriend, and he meets another woman, Susan. Is it Susan? Let's have a look. Yeah, and he meets a woman called Susan, who he has the feeling he's met before, and they immediately start an affair and move in together. And Susan is running a business selling typewriters and doing mimeographs, doing copies of documents, and she hasn't got much of a business head. She has a partner who's quite a bit of a downer, and they get involved, and Stuart moves in, and Susan has a child from a previous relationship, and as you see, it's all very soap opera-y. And then it begins to dawn on them where they knew each other before. It turns out that Susan, who is 10 years older than Stuart, was actually once his teacher when he was 11 years old, and he was quite a naughty little boy. And into their lives intrudes a salesman called Milton Lumky, and Milton Lumky is this sort of wise older man spending his time driving around. He's a sales rep, and he sort of starts to school Stuart in the ways of business, and Stuart thinks that he can sort of really turn the typewriter business around. So there's an awful lot about that, and Lumky isn't somebody who makes gnomic utterances, but he is a wiser old guy. He's quite lonely, he's quite sick, he's got a very flashy car, but he sort of reminds me of the sort of character, if this was a film, he'd be ideally played by somebody like Harry Dean Stanton, or possibly Emmett Walsh if he was still around, because he's not physically like Stanton. He's sort of a short, sort of dumpy sort of guy. And it reminded me really of Alex Cox's film Repo Man, which really is kind of the most Dickian film there is out there. It's been more Dickian than the Dickian adaptations. If you've never seen Repo Man, it's great fun, because it's about that conflict between rebellion and business and those sort of issues, except it's set in early 80s California. And these are California novels, of course, as well. And it's absolutely fantastic. And you just sort of see these characters and their flaws and their absurdities. So these are not books which are addressing the kind of big issues which Dick tackles later on in his SF. They're looking at the small things in people's lives, which are nonetheless very important to them, because most people are not touched by big issues directly in their lives, just by the small things of trying to make a buck and get by. And I really can't say enough good about Milton Lumky territory. And this was published by Pattering in the UK. This is a Gollancz hardcover. I got this comparatively recently, I think, and there was a nice US edition before that, which is well worth looking out for, and is very beautiful. So that's a good one, in Milton Lumky territory. So certainly watch out for Pattering About in a Small Land and in Milton Lumky territory. And as I say, I think these are in print. They're either Gollancz or Collins, one of the two. And really then, those for me are kind of the high watermark. I think the critics disagree. There are ones yet to come which they would say are better. Another novel from this period, which is, again, its origins and what have you are quite obscure, is Humpty, Dumpty in Oakland. And this is the Gollancz first edition UK. And Oakland, of course, is sort of North San Francisco area. And again, it's a business narrative. It's about an older guy who owns a garage, and he has a bad heart. He wants to retire. He's selling up, but he leases part of his lot to a younger guy who's not a very successful businessman, who is sort of doing up and selling old cars, you know, and he's selling for like $100 and what have you. So, you know, he's not a successful guy. So you see this relatively successful, long-established businessman subletting part of his lot to this younger guy. And he sells the business on, and he doesn't tell the younger guy about this until the deal is done. And there's a customer who comes along and who is really sort of like disappointed by the fact that the old guy, Jim, is moving on. And he sort of tries to get Jim to sort of invest in a new business further out of town, so that just so he can continue to have his garden up. And the sort of this third character owns like a record label and a record pressing plant. So, you know, you're seeing all these entrepreneurial types jockeying for position, and it's quite interesting. This is a more minor one, but the tone of Milton Lumky territory and this are quite similar, even though I think Milton Lumky's better. So again, you're looking at these things, and small town Californian life, Main Street, USA. So you are getting this wonderful sort of community feeling from these books. And you know, there's all sorts of other issues as well, and these come up probably in the more famous novels in this tranche, which we're going to talk about next. So even though those sort of business, personal relationship centered novels are probably my favourites of Dick's mainstream novels, the sort of mid to late 50s things, there are two from the very end of that period which are arguably a lot more important in Dick's canon in a more objective sort of way. And of those, I would say the one which is of the most immediate interest to SF readers is Confessions of a Crap Artist, and there's the Pattering edition from the late 80s. And this is the only one of Dick's mainstream novels published in his lifetime. It was issued in 1974, and I think it was Mark Zeising published it? I can't recall. But that was the only one published. And this was actually made into a film in France called Barjo, which I've never seen. It has been released on VHS somewhere a long, long time ago. It's a very obscure film. I'd love to see it. Can you imagine a Philip K. Dick film which none of us have seen? And imagine a small number of people have seen it, and I've never seen bootlegs out there. And I can't understand why it hasn't been issued on DVD or Blu-ray, though I've not checked recently, but it'd be big news. So there is a French film of this. Now, Confessions of a Crap Artist is a first-person narrative. Again, this is an unusual thing in PKD. You don't really get it till quite late. We Can Build You is a first-person narrative, and that's unusual. That was very unusual in a Dick science fiction novel, and you get that in some of the later novels, and it's the only time really it comes up in one of the mainstream novels. And Confessions of a Crap Artist is about a character called Jack Isidore, who is a tire regroover. Now, I think we've seen that before, haven't we? I think it's in... Is it in Frolics 8? In one of the books, at least, there's a tire regroover. And Jack Isidore, of course, is a name that pops up in Duandra's Dream of Electric Sheep, where there's Isidore works in the pet repair shop, the shop that repairs the electrical pets. And of course, in Blade Runner, he's renamed as J.F. Sebastian, and is quite a different character. He's a special in Do Androids Dream. So you see names and things popping up and up again with Dick. And he's somebody who's like a repository of useless information. He tends to believe all the cranky 40 and stuff, and he sort of really walks around looking at people from a detached viewpoint. And what's interesting about this is that there are two versions of this novel, or rather this novel fed into another one, and that novel is Time Out of Joint. Now, reading these two together is fascinating experience. Now, Time Out of Joint for me is easily Dick's best novel of the 1950s, and this is the one which the Truman Show supposedly ripped off, the Jim Carrey film, and it's about this guy called Regal Gum, who is he's sort of living with his sister, and his sister's husband is rather sort of unhappy about this, and he's just a bum. He drifts around, and he does this game every day in the paper, which is like spot where the little green man is. But what he's actually doing, well, I won't tell you, but this becomes an SF novel a little bit of the way through. So Regal Gum and Jack Isidore are fundamentally the same character, and in this sort of pairing, you see the strength of Dick's science fiction versus the sort of uncertain fumbling that you get in some of his mainstream novels. And even though this is really good and it's fascinating because it's first person, I would say this is the better book. But if you're a real fan and you just read one of the mainstream novels, it's really important to read this alongside Time Out of Joint, because you get a real idea into Dick's sort of working processes and how writers will sometimes use and reuse material for commercial reasons to try and get some of them rework it for artistic reasons, because of course this wasn't published and this was. So that's a really interesting thing to look at. And to me, I mean, this is common knowledge. A lot of people don't seem to be aware of it. So those two really are a kind of thematic diptych, which is kind of an interesting thing, really. The first of Dick's mainstream novels that I read was the first one that was published in a mass market format in the UK, and that was this. And this is The Man Whose Teeth Were All Exactly Alike, which is again a typical strange Dickian title, and as you see it riffs on American Gothic there, the famous painting. And one of the things that comes up in this, and it's not the major theme, but it is something which sparks off conflict between the sort of two central characters, is racism. And something that's in a lot of these books, these mainstream books, is it does show the attitude that white people had towards black people in America at that time, because of course black people were still ghettoized. There was segregation and most of them were poor. There are some characters in Humpty, Dumpty and Oakland who are more middle class and aspirational black characters, and that's quite interesting as well. And there's this conflict in this book basically between a set of neighbours, and the men sort of fall out, and one of them, Leo Runcible, and you know, you get Runcible sounds like Glenn Runciter from Ubik, and Leo of course is like Louis, is it Leo, let's think, what is Leo in, is it Three Stigmata, or is it Martian Time Slip? I can't recall. Leo Bolero. And, you know, you see these names popping up again, and there's this conflict between the two men, and they've fallen out. And there's a certain amount of hypocrisy because Runcible is Jewish, and there are comments about Jews in this, which, you know, where people regard as racist. And they're not comments from Dick's point of view. This is not the, you know, representative of a type thing. This is just reflecting how some people were in America at that time. So there's a conflict between the two men, which centers around one of them brings a black friend home and makes a joke that, you know, that'll bring the realty sort of prices down in the area. And one of the other men is sort of disgusted by that, but at the same time, he sort of under the skin kinds of agrees. So there's a lot of hypocrisy involved, and they fall out. And it then goes into this bizarre subplot about a Neanderthal skull, which is found on one of the men's land and dug up, and it becomes a bit of a thing. So this conflict between the two men starts to sort of spread out into this, is this a real fossil or not thing? And Kim Stanley Robinson said that one of the problems with Philip K. Dick's mainstream novels was that he was unable to stay away from the fantastic in them. And yeah, while the titles are redolent of his SF titles, particularly the later ones, things like Flow My Tears, A Policeman Said, it's absolutely not true. There are unlikely things in this one and in Confessions of a Crap Artist, but, you know, they are mostly domestic narratives. And, you know, it has to be said that it's just that thing where, because we know Philip K. Dick as a science fiction writer, we know him as a science fiction writer first, then, you know, we automatically start to look for these things. And, you know, the feel is there because of the character interactions and that classic Dick thing where you get a web of characters, you get strong and weak people in different positions in society, you know. So it isn't really a criticism that carries water, I think. This was written in 1960, and it was actually commissioned by Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, so they never published it at the time. So it looks like Dick got paid for it, or at least was encouraged to write it, but as I say, it was never published at the time. And then in 1961, I don't think he published anything. This was the period, I believe, when he might have been working for one of his wives in the jewellery sort of making shop and what have you. And that led to his next book, The Man in the High Castle. So this was the last book he wrote before writing Man in the High Castle. That's my old Berkeley Putnam one. And of course, you know, it's these days it's in Penguin Modern Classics. It's got a different cover to this now, but isn't that absolutely gorgeous? So it is an interesting thing where there's that gap, and Dick sort of gives up writing mainstream novels at that point. And the one before this was Confessions of a Crap Artist, and of course you get that reworked in Time Out of Joint or vice versa. So it comes to a point there, it comes to an end, and Dick ceases to write mainstream novels. As I say, this was the first of Dick's mainstream novels I read. I have read it a couple of times. It's not one of my favourites, but a book that it reminds me of, which I really love and which I included in my book 100 Must Read Science Fiction Novels, is Michael Bishop's Ancient of Days, which again looks at racism, and it looks at an anachronistic proto-human suddenly appearing in California. So there's a kind of link there between those two things. And Bishop, of course, is a massive PKD fan and a humanist to boot. And I think really that Dick would have loved this. I really could see he'd love this. And this is a great book. Try and pick it up if you can. So what are the sort of main feelings about Dick's mainstream novels? Well, they never got published. They weren't regarded as being good enough. They didn't really work out. He had this other career going on which did work for him. And I think some of the criticisms are, I'm going to refer to Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote a great book about PKD called The Novels of Philip K. Dick, which is very, very rare now, and I bought it when it first came out in 1987. And some of the things that Kim said then were that something that Dick does in these novels, he gives equal weight to unimportant events. He hasn't sort of learned the act of editing out the unimportant parts of the story and just referring to them quickly and moving on. And he says that he sort of conquered that later on. I would say this is rather similar to the discussion that I had in the pub the other day with Alistair McNaught and James Wright, where they're talking about, you know, how you get peripheral characters in life, and you feel if you're going to write a novel, it should have realism in it and it should have peripheral characters and that. And James is saying, well, maybe that's a problem for the novel, that really you shouldn't sort of be too concerned about that and get on with the plot and what have you. And, you know, I think Kim Stanley Robinson's a bit of a fine one to talk with you, because you get a book like Pacific Edge where, you know, there's this utopian community and all this sort of stuff about water and the problems and what have you. And, you know, Kim, of course, pads things out enormously in his successful books, from the Mars books on. They're huge, you know, and you can't tell me that it's all important important. I think there's a lot of extraneous stuff in there. So I think we can forgive Philip K. Dick for that. So, you know, I'd say that there's sort of realism, really. He was trying to get that realism thing. And yeah, you know, when you read Pattering About in a Small Land, there are some things in it which you think, well, it could have been cut down. But you do get a really full picture of the characters, as flawed and interesting as they are. So I would say that isn't really that valid a criticism, though I guess, you know, the professional publisher would have looked at it and said, well, you know, this isn't quite as sort of muscular and spare as it could have been. So it's a fair point in some ways, I guess. And really, you know, Kim also says the books are fairly humorless and that they're pretty straightforward. And he does have a point, actually. They don't really have a lot of the sort of black humour that you get in later PKD, but it's mostly in the later PKD, let's be honest. It's in the sort of 60s, 70s stuff. It's not so much there in the very early work, except in terms of the way some of the twists and the novelties come out when the novums come at the end of stories and you get conceptual breakthrough. So I wouldn't say that's entirely valid either. And, you know, why does a novel have to be humorous? I mean, I think it's because we look at some of the funny aspects of things like Ubik and what have you. And we're looking at the mainstream novels through the glass of the SF novels, and I don't essentially think that's the way to do it. So finally, to return again to the implication that Dick couldn't stay away from the fantastic, and that it's always implied in these books, as I say, that's not the case. I think the strongest case of that is in Man Whose Teeth, where there is this fossil that's found and there's this question about whether it's authentic or not, and when the explanation comes through, it's not exactly a speculative element. It is a scientific element, but it's not really a speculative element, though I guess you could claim it would be, but I don't think it is. I think it's perfectly rational, real world thing, and that I don't think it's that speculative at all. It just feels that way because it's about science, but it's not about a form of science we haven't got yet, which you get all the time in the Dick sort of SF novels. So that's there. Speaking as somebody who's read everything that's ever been published by Philip K. Dick, with the exception of one volume of letters I never got around to buying, which I really must sort of address. I've got all the other volumes, so that one I don't have. Really, you will sort of want to read everything if you're like me, because you obviously, if you read that much of somebody, you must like them. And I love Philip K. Dick, and have done for, you know, decades and decades and decades. So, you know, they were all essential reads for me, and they were all interesting in their own way. But what I would say is, really, if you're more casual about it and your jam more is SF than general fiction, you will want to focus more on the ones which are deemed to be from the late 50s. So do look at The Man Whose Teeth Are All Exactly Alike. Take a special note of Confessions of a Crap Artist and its comparison to Time Out of Joint. If you haven't read Time Out of Joint, read it now, because it's brilliant, one of Dick's best novels. So it's really important to consider those in tandem. And as I say, this one was the last thing he wrote before High Castle, so that's really important because there's a big step forward in the quality of his work there, even though he wasn't always consistent about the quality even in the 1960s. And really look at this sort of great novels about personal relationships and small business life. You know, Pattering About in a Small Land, as I say, is a big favourite of mine. And in Milton Lumky territory, again, I would focus on. And as a sort of third choice amongst those, Humpty, Dumpty and Oakland. And, you know, they've got these wacky titles. They've got this wonderful multi-character thing going on. All the virtues that you expect from PKD, the focus on the little man. And, you know, they give you a wonderful insight into California in the 1950s. And I absolutely love them. I think they're great. And I've not met many serious Philip K. Dick fans who don't like them. So this is Outlaw Bookseller. That's the first Philip K. Dick video we've done for ages and ages. Maybe we'll do some more. But I just felt that really these are neglected books, and yet they're in print, so somebody must be reading them. That's why they're there. So get out, try some, let me know what you think. Bye for now.